right, welcome back. Before we start, I'll explain a few things. We very kindly ask you to wear your masks during the sessions, and for those who have forgotten their masks or don't have any with them, you can pick medical masks up at the entrance. They are available for you there. So we have a translation into German spoken language here on site at Kampnagel, and if you want to try it out and don't have a headphone yet, you can also pick them up over there at the entrance. Unfortunately, there's no translation into German spoken language in the stream, but only subtitles. I will repeat that in German now. Wir haben hier eine Simultanübersetzung ins Deutsche, in die deutsche Lautsprache. Und falls Sie die mal ausprobieren möchten, können Sie sich sehr gerne Headphones am Eingang holen. Leider gibt es im Stream keine Übersetzung in die deutsche Lautsprache, und stattdessen nur, was heißt nur, aber Untertitel. So, where did I stop? Yeah, and for our viewers in the stream, of course, if you prefer subtitles in English, German, Afan, Oromo, or Luganda, please check the video description at the bottom of the YouTube stream. There you will also find a link to the subtitle function, and the subtitles in Micha will be unfortunately added a bit later. They will be available in a recording from August 29 at the latest. And if the subtitle function doesn't start directly after you opened the subtitle function, don't be worried, just a little bit patient. It will start after about 20 seconds. So now, welcome back here in the theater at Kampnagel. In the first part of today's conference, Mia Mingus and Lilith Wittmann talked about issues of access, intimacy, infrastructures, and data justice. Is my microphone okay so far? Okay, yeah. And they attacked the ableist status quo of software technologies, the status quo of capitalist societies built on heteronormativity and white supremacy. And the next panel will also ask, among other things, about technological strategies of resistance against these systems, among other things, of course, of oppression, albeit with a different focus. The panel is curated by Khadijah Abdurahman, who will also moderate the conversation on Blackness, African Indigeneity, and Computation. Khadijah is part of the Curators team of this year's conference. Khadijah is an abolitionist whose research focus is predictive analytics in the New York welfare system and tech in the Horn of Africa. And now, I don't want to say too much right now, but leave the stage to Khadijah and the other experts and speakers. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Seda, and I want to again thank you for your excellent moderation at yesterday evening's opening panel with myself and the other curators. I also want to thank Kampnagel for providing this opportunity to each of us as curators to kind of not just be a participant in the festival, but also invite our people and take up space in Germany, which is very exciting. And thank you specifically to Lena and Lorena. And so with that, I'm super excited for today's panel discussion. I'm also just personally, I've been in conversation with each Ayantu, Kalundi, and Romy for the last 2 years in regards to their work as it intersects with technology. And it's so exciting to have all three of them together. It's not very typical that you have any kind of public space opened up to talk about Black indigeneity relative to the African continent, never mind how it intersects with technology. And so when data and tech policy typically makes a claim on the global South, it generally defaults to international relations and particularly a normalization of the Westphalian state. And so I've spent the last 2 years thinking with each of them about what can we understand when indigeneity is applied as an analytic. how can we upset the conceptions of the normative indigenous subject as non-Black and never African? And just a few words on particularly my work as it relates to Ayantu is on the surface. Ayantu is a PhD candidate studying archival science at UCLA. And I'm looking at predictive risk models in the family policing or child protection services in New York City, as well as thinking about platform governance in the Horn of Africa. And on the surface, these are seemingly disparate entities. And I mentioned this a little bit yesterday, but data and tech policy is really terrible at science communication. And one of the primary things that seems to be totally confusing to people is what the hell is data? And you hear people interact with the concept of data often through analogy, and you hear data as oil, big tech is like big tobacco, but what is this thing that we call data? And one of the things that has been really helpful to me is thinking about data collection as a process of producing an archive. And we know, drawing on archival science, that archives are crucial to state power and are an infrastructure through which public memory is contested and stored. And so it's through Ayantu actually that I've been able to make great leaps in my understanding about predictive risk modeling, because ultimately you have this moment of capture in which you're trying to take the incommensurability of Black life in particular and then nail it down and to be this defined, rigid thing from the eyes of the state. And so what can the oral histories of indigenous peoples and the Oromos in particular tell us about computation, tell us about state building projects, and about the future of indigenous people on the African continent? And then next, I would also like to shout out, I'm glad Kalundi, I'm sad, couldn't be here in person, but Kalundi's work has been really formative for me, in particular thinking about Ethiopia. Ethiopia in the public imaginary, and particularly on the left, is thought to be the pinnacle of Black freedom. And the mythology goes that Ethiopia was never colonized, and the brutal monarch Haile Selassie is a freedom fighter. And Kalundi, although writing from Kampala, Uganda, has an excellent piece that I strongly recommend and that I think is also hyperlinked on the Future of Code Politics website, Speak of Me As I Am, which is an in-depth critique of Mahmoud Mamdani's kind of Ethiopian pro-state narrative. And particularly Mamdani makes this claim that there's neither settler nor native, that indigeneity was produced by Western intervention and white colonizers, as if there was no such thing as nationhood and no such thing as nationalities on the African continent. And he has an excellent takedown, clap back of that, as we like to say in Brooklyn. And then with Romi Morrison, I'm actually trying to remember where we we met through Catherine McKittrick. So We Be Imagining, which is a public interest technology project drawing on the Black radical tradition at Columbia University. I had done a podcast interview with Black geographer in Canada, Catherine McKittrick, who then recommended me to Romi Morrison. And we have an episode on We Be Imagining called Thinking About a Black Sense of Place. And on one level, geography, cartography is something that's also very affiliated with state-making projects, who gets to decide where is the border, right? It's traditionally you think of a very colonial project, but there's so many radical geographers, including Romi, who are really thinking about a sense of place otherwise, and what is a much more fluid, dynamic, and more capacious way to think about people's relationship to the land. And they recently published a piece, I don't have the name of the publication, but in Digital Humanities, opening with June Jordan's poem, thinking about the economization and the valuation of Black life, but life in general, given neoliberalization and kind of the series of economic precedents that were set after Reagan. And so with that, I'm going to introduce each of our panelists. And so I hope that I didn't ramble on too long, but they're each going to give a 5-minute presentation on how their work intersects with the title of today's event. Since they come from such a broad range of backgrounds, I thought that would be a good way for us to enter in. And so first, we have Ayantu Tibeso, who is a scholar focusing on transnational indigenous Oromo knowledge production and archival erasure and the construction of Ethiopian national narratives. She is a Kota Robles Fellow and doctoral student in information studies at UCLA with a concentration in archival studies. Her primary research interests explore the intersections of archives, historical knowledge production, and indigenous knowledge and record-keeping systems. Her work is rooted in African context, with Ethiopia at the center of much of her analysis. She is passionate about decolonizing knowledge and revaluing and harnessing indigenous knowledge for the well-being of communities globally. Romy Ron Morrison is an interdisciplinary artist, researcher, and educator. Their work investigates the personal, political, and ideological and spatial boundaries of race, ethics, and social infrastructure with digital technologies. Using maps, data, sound, performance, and video, their installations center Black diasporic technologies that challenge the demands of an increasingly quantified world, reducing land into property, people into digits, and knowledge into data. Romy has exhibited work and given talks at numerous exhibitions, conferences, and workshops around the world, including Transmedial, Berlin, Tribeca Film Festival, the American Institute of Architects, Museum of Contemporary Art, Chicago. Their writing has appeared in publications by MIT Press, University of California Press, Open Humanities, and Logic Magazine. They are currently an Annenberg Fellow in the School of Cinematic Arts at USC in Los Angeles. And finally, we have Kalundi Serumaga, who is an historian, journalist, filmmaker, and cultural activist. Among others, he is the associate editor of The New African, an English-language monthly news magazine based in the UK. His work has been published in leading African literary magazines such as Kwani and The Africa Report. He has previously served as the director, artistic and administrative of Uganda National Cultural Center. Under his leadership, the center became well known as a place of intellectual cultural growth, decolonization, and entertainment. He was one of the creative minds behind very popular Ugandan soaps such as That Is Life Mwatu or Entebbe. Kalundi Serumaga has also taught at the Makerere University in Uganda. He became renowned also as the host of Radio 1 talk show, Spectrum. Since the September riots 2009, Kalundi has been arrested and assaulted for publicly airing his political views. Having lived in exile in Kenya and the UK, he also knows a thing or two about being a refugee. So if you could just give a round of applause for each of our esteemed guests. Thank you. And so we'll open first with Romy.
Thank you for that introduction, Khadijah. Before I start, usually when I give talks like this, it's always a little bit of like a destabilizing thing to speak in front of a big crowd of people, especially since a lot of our work, I think, tends to be not just academic or occupational, but it's also personal. So I usually make explicit that this is an act of vulnerability a little bit in us sharing and also in you listening. So hoping that we can agree that that can be a place to at least start the conversation for today. In thinking about the theme for this conference in particular, I think it's helpful for me to kind of situate myself in the work that I do a bit. So my educational background is in Black studies and gender studies. Immediately after that, I moved to New Orleans and post-Katrina New Orleans, particularly working in housing and thinking about this kind of intersection between access to housing and how Blackness and gender kind of re-articulate who has access to different types of resources, essentially. And then began working with other artists that were trying to mount very dialogical projects around the state of housing in New Orleans, and starting to think about histories of spatial racial dispossession. This really led me to doing my master's work in New York at Parsons School of Design and starting to more formalize some of these tactics for understanding how space is made to be concrete, made to be visualized in order for certain types of control or management to be a lot easier, which led to a lot of cartography and map making. And so I was particularly interested in histories of dispossession, particularly racial and spatial, through practices like redlining in the US, for example. And I'm saying all of this to lead up to this kind of big break, and I guess my falling out of trying to use data metrics or mapping as a way to try and understand the politics of race and space. And so while working with redlining would look at the kind of historic map. So for those that are unfamiliar, redlining was a practice in the US, particularly during the kind of New Deal, in which while there's trying to be a federal program for mortgages as like a modern kind of concept, there needed to be risk security maps to decide where those resources would be given out spatially. And one of the key metrics that was used to make these determinations was census-based data, primarily where Black people lived and also new immigrants to the US. And so those areas were coded as red on the map, and they were systematically denied access to things like the mortgage. This also becomes a kind of foundational practice for then denying other types of services later. And so these maps still exist. This happened for about 248 cities across the US, and became a kind of foundational way in which dispossession of resources were differentially allocated in cities, primarily using, again, census-based data, and racial identification and immigration status were like the criteria that were most commonly used. So you can find these maps, and I would take them and basically bring them into GIS software and use them as geographies to look at contemporary data sets to try to understand this long kind of duree and slow violence of dispossession based on these decisions made in the 1930s. And trying to do this because data has been so central to how urban planners are making decisions within space. And at the time was in these urban design fellowships, so it would make my really pretty maps and show everyone them. And then they would look at them, and rather than there being this kind of, I don't know, ethical crisis or like outrage about this history of violence, the map and the data made it almost commonsensical. People would look at them and they would say, yes, that's of course what I would expect to happen. And so there's a kind of disservice that the data did in that it took something that's a very violent history and made it quite palatable for people to kind of ingest and kind of absorb just as information or as knowledge. The other thing that it does is it tends to reify these spaces as only sites of abjection or only sites of dispossession. Khadijah kind of introduced me through Catherine McKittrick, who's a really phenomenal Black geographer. She has this term herbicide as a way to think about some of these things that often when we're trying to meaningfully redress these instances of violence and are dependent on tools like mapping or tools like data, we tend to do a disservice by kind of reinscribing and rewriting these spaces over and over again as only sites of violence, which then elides or obscures any kind of movement building in response to those things. And so this is what has kind of led me into artistic practice, really trying to understand these histories of violence, and particularly the logics that underpin the tools that we use to try to visualize them, things like maps or data, and particularly their kind of lineage to post-Enlightenment fields of thought. And so this has really led me to now trying to contend with what computation kind of means in this context. So right now, the work that I'm doing as a PhD student is really trying to understand how computation reframes how space is managed and thought, the imaginaries that are kind of imbued, and also the fantasies of control that therefore happen over space. So in the US in particular, this kind of arises post-war, like late 1950s, early 1960s, through federal programs that are explicitly trying to introduce cybernetic sort of knowledges of feedback and of automated regulation into municipalities in order to allocate resources, but also directly in response to fears about urban Black rebellion. So for example, there's an organization called the Los Angeles Community Analysis Bureau, which is explicitly trying to chart things like housing blight data in order to predict where Black urban rebellion might happen. So there's a strange relationship between Blackness, cybernetics, and computation within cities, where there's still that perpetuation of Blackness as threat or as ungovernable that authorizes these new types of power to come into decision-making within cities. So part of my research is trying to understand that kind of lineage and the centrality of, again, reifying Blackness as threat in order to authorize new technologies, as well as to look at a kind of dialectic by which Blackness also imbues its own sense of technology, its own ways of making decisions about space and moving across space. So I'm interested in trying to reformulate ideas of computation that are very much vested in Black diasporic movement as well. There are two kind of key case studies that I look at. One is this very contested history about something called the freedom quilts, which are kind of rumored to have been a series of wayfinding and encoding geospatial information into quilting patterns that are then disseminated during the antebellum South in order to landmark safe places of refuge for escaping enslaved people. So in order to know places to collect resources like new clothing, tools, and also to know like where safe houses would be. So it's a fairly sophisticated system of knowing how to encode, circulate, and then redistribute information that's based on trust, that's based on quilting bees, and it involves things like plotting trajectories, calculating how much mileage you'd be able to kind of transport yourself within a day. And then the second case study that I'm looking at is something called the Negro Murderous Green Book, which essentially started as an informal guide during Jim Crow South in the US, trying to mark safe places for Black folks to access, things like hotels, restaurants, gas filling stations. And what's particularly fascinating to me is how the information circulates in this example. This was started by Victor H. Green and Alma Green in the 1930s. And essentially, Victor Green was a retired postal worker who taps into the Postal Worker Union in order to have mail couriers, while they're walking their routes delivering mail, to do this kind of crowdsourcing of safe spaces, often through direct kind of communication and kind of mitigation with people who are in the neighborhood, right? So it's this way of circulating information through social ties, usually through more informal social ties, in order to mount a nationally scaled system for learning how to transgress very racialized and violent space. So in these examples, I'm interested in what cybernetics looks like in that case study versus the ways that it's implemented as a kind of post-war military technology within urban space, explicitly to predict Black urban rebellion. So two very different and kind of clashing examples for me to really wrestle with what computation means, and so that when we're trying to redress some of the violences of it, we're able to pull from very different lexicons and very different considerations that are in excess of things like individual rights, or that don't glamorize the kind of automatic ways in which we think about transparency, but that certain types of opacity or covert movement are actually very necessary for some people to survive.
Thank you. Ayantu.
Can you hear me all right? Okay. As you were talking, Romy, I was trying to figure out where to begin, because I think it's difficult to situate oneself sometimes. I mean, we're in Germany, and we were just talking last night how in the US, the state funding the arts, or funding like a program like this, is completely unthinkable. So I just want to say thank you to all the curators, to the producers, to people who picked us up at the airport, everyone involved in this fantastic production. I'll begin, I guess, by talking about how I come to archival studies and this larger field of information studies, because I think, yeah, that path is curious even to me, especially since I met you. I've really come to realize that. Before I started the PhD program, I was involved for many years in transnational activism, mostly out of Minneapolis, and working a lot in Oromia. There was a youth protest movement called the Oromo protest that was so central to my thinking. Whenever I was doing a lot of writing, trying to explain, trying to situate this movement, trying to situate what does it mean historically for an American audience, mostly like other activists and left-leaning people. And I was just, at every turn, I encountered both lack of information, but also whatever information existed was not useful. It didn't explain Ethiopia as a problem. And I mean that in terms of Ethiopia, the state is a problem for Oromo people and for a lot of indigenous people in the Horn of Africa, as are many states around the world. Rather, a lot of the a lot of what existed or what we encountered as activists was information that, or knowledge that framed the people, like the existence of the Oromo people, for example, as a problem for the state, which is a very troubling and damaging but common representation. So I became very, I felt very despondent about this, and somehow I came across, actually, no. My friend Abdi Roble of the Somali Documentary Project is an archivist, and I'd been talking to him about what archives can do. And it occurred to me that this might be a field through which I can think about how knowledge is created and how we can create like alternative sources of knowledge so that Oromo people, and I'm thinking specifically from the context of Oromo people, because not only because I'm an Oromo, but because this is where my work is situated. And so when I came into archival studies, I found myself in a kind of twilight zone of sort, where there was a kind of like doubly silencing that occurs of a group of people who are maintaining knowledge, who are preserving knowledge, who are creating knowledge, and sharing knowledge orally, but not just orally, but in other multiple ways that are not written. So there is this, actually, archival studies has really helped me understand how much the written word and writing is so important to the social sciences in general, and a lot of thinking about what knowledge is worthy. And I found in this field, I found it very difficult to think about what does indigenous knowledge and indigenous archives look like that doesn't look like a Western archive, because in the Western sense, here's a building, here's some documents, here's the person who's in custody of those documents, and here's the researcher who comes to use these documents. It's a very specific way of thinking about knowledge. And here I am within such a field asking, well, what are the other ways? And by other, I don't mean alternative, because I mean ontologically, what are the other ways of creating knowledge and keeping knowledge? And actually, Khadijah, meeting you has pushed me further in thinking about this direction, because it can be very lonely in archival science, trying to think about a non-Western context, trying to think about non-written ways of archiving. So I feel like I should maybe stop there for now, and then we'll elaborate further. But I feel like this is just like a general context that's useful.
Sure, I do want to just, thank you so much. Yes, and no, you guys are like heavy hitters. I'm excited, to be in this conversation with you. Oh, I was just about to be like making some jokes to kill time because I was concerned that Kalundi was not here. But Kalundi has arrived again. Kalundi, can you hear us okay?
I can hear you, yes.
Okay,
I
your
can
time
hear
to
you.
shine.
Mumpolida.
No, I was saying you go ahead. You can share your 5 minutes now.
Ati ntandise naye mwanga ntinja kubanga nsobola okwogera mu Luganda ate kati simmanyi tunabeera mu lulimi ki gw'obumbulira kubanga n'omukyalo oli ayogeddeko nti ono bajja kubaawo okwogera mu Luganda omukulu omuteesiteesi. Okay, let me switch to English then, because I don't speak German. Good day to everybody, and thank you very much for inviting me to this event. Thank you to Ayantu and to Khadijah and to the organizers. My name is Kalundi, as said. I've been a bit disturbed because I have to now go on from especially the things Romy was talking about, which are exactly the concerns we have. We work here in Uganda. For the longest time, I've been, I suppose, some kind of a native activist. I wanted to go very quickly to understand these terms. We have used the word indigeneity. The problem is that indigeneity is associated with the concept of rusticism and being up in remote mountains and in faraway places. Our problem, our issue, is what happens when your indigeneity is actually at the center of the state that has been built around it. And this is a very big problem for Oromo people. And it is an equally big problem for Baganda people and people in other parts of colonized and still colonized spaces. Blackness is also problematic because if you, the conquest was given a color to a very great extent, but not uniformly. And some of the worst colonial conquests have been by people of the same color onto themselves. If you look at the history of, for example, the Irish people, and if you also look at the history of some of the things that happened to the German people when they were forcibly converted into Christianity, especially, I'm told, the people around the area of the Black Forest, wherever that might be. So we have a problem here in our work. One, the powers have all the technology and we don't, or we don't have it in an organized way. And therefore, as a consequence, historically, the powers have all the information and we don't. If I build on what Romy was saying, one thing that Africans are here now in Africa is that we are some of the most measured people, I think, on the planet now, because we have been targeted by various forms of measurement through anthropology, geology, agronomy, accounting, geography, and others. They know how many we are, where we live, what we do, what we produce, how tall we are, how much we weigh, how often we reproduce, and so on and so forth. We know very little in the opposite direction. The problem is that you have to look at it in terms of a veterinary versus a butcher. You see, when a vet is presented with an item of livestock, a goat or a sheep or a cow, the vet is looking at this animal from the point of view of how to rehabilitate it, how to restore it to full health. So they will measure it and take it in various ways, temperature, weight, eating, and so on and so forth, and come to a conclusion. A butcher will look at exactly the same animal, but from a completely different perspective. He will look at the same things. Is it healthy? Why is it not healthy? How much does it weigh? But the butcher's interest is to then cut the animal up, to kill it and cut it up and consume it or make it available for others to consume. Whereas the vet has the opposite interest, at least initially anyway. And so the problem is not the technology per se, but in whose hands is it, who is controlling it? What is the motive of the person managing this technology? That is one problem, but the problem before that is that do you even have access to that technology anyway? In Uganda today, since the 1990s, there was a massive migration by the states onto digital platforms, starting with the intelligence services. They began to spy on us, especially as mobile phones rolled out. And this has now migrated to, first of all, the issuance of the national identification card system, which I found very interesting because one of the countries, our so-called
Kalundi, can you just check your connection? Because we're losing you. Kalundi, can you hear me? Okay. Okay, so Kalundi will come back. I'm sorry that he's getting interrupted. I mean, this is one of the realities that we operate in. I don't know if any of you have ever been African and applied for a visa to Germany, but let me tell you, they call it Fortress Europe for a reason. And, you know, as you guys are completing PhD dissertations, you know, the visa process is very similar. And so this is one of the realities, right, is that Kalundi could not be here with us in person. And then also to be online, you know, the connection can sometimes be tenuous. But I have some confidence that Kalundi will return, and, you know, I'm just sad. Oh, you back.
I take that as a hint for me to stop talking.
Well, do you want to make your last comment? Because you dropped off in the middle of a sentence. Do you want to make a last comment before we move on?
Yeah, very diplomatically put. So yes, what we're trying to do is we are trying to catch up. We are trying to know as much about ourselves, number one, and then two, as much about our enemies as our enemies know about us. So we're trying to bridge a physical database gap, because everything now in Uganda is being licensed. If you want to fish, you have to have a license. If you want to grow coffee, they want us to have a license. That's why we remain the way we are. For example, you are there in Germany. The German coffee industry buys a huge amount of coffee from Uganda because we are one of the largest exporters. And Germans make easily between the German corporations, one of which incidentally was involved in large-scale eviction of farmers in order to build its plantation here. German companies make between 6 to 8 times as much money per kilo of coffee as the farmers here do when they export it raw. So our challenge is on all sorts of things. I could talk to you about the sacred site map thing as my final comment. We are spiritually suffocated because most of our sacred indigenous sites were destroyed, or rather, state institutions and religious institutions were built on top of them, largely the Catholic and Anglican churches, but also the colonial state. And we are trying, as one thing of liberating ourselves from being suffocated, is to build a map of where all these sites actually are, whether they're under somebody else's building or not. As a first part of the beginning, a conversation of how do we recover ourselves spiritually in order that we might be able to recover physically and even mentally. I'll stop there for now. Thank you very much.
Romy, Kalundi, Ayantu, thank you so much to each of you for such capacious framing. I don't know how frequently those of you who are in the audience in person or online are attending panels like critically examining technology, but this kind of analysis is so rare. In the early part of the 21st century, there was a lot of techno-optimism. Then you had the tech bubble burst, and you have what we call the techlash, and this idea that, okay, you know, you can't just be an engineer. Tech is not neutral. There's some bad stuff happening. Tech maybe is racist in some way, but the way race is articulated, the way gender is articulated is that it's a metonym for marginalization, for abjectness, and some of the ways that Romy described vis-a-vis geography. And the focus is always on downstream harms. And so what I'm hearing from you guys is a much more capacious understanding of race, of history, and its relationship to place and land. And so I was wondering, you know, in part this is, and Kalundi, you began to touch on it as well, but if both of you and Ayantu could speak a little more to what is Black indigeneity on the continent, especially because, you know, within indigenous studies, there's this idea that to be indigenous is rarely Black and never African, right? And so aren't all Black people indigenous to Africa? And so, you know, I was thinking when Ayantu was describing the Oromo protests in Ethiopia, there was a major singer that I know is central to Ayantu's work, Hachalu Hundessa, who was unfortunately assassinated in the summer of 2020, an Oromo singer. And one of his most famous songs is Malanjira, or Do I Even Exist? And this is very much the positionality of Black indigenous people on the continent, both in general and in relationship to technology. So if you guys could expand a little bit on that. And then for Romy, I was hoping that you could speak a little further to your recent publication, Voluptuous Disintegration, and the idea of Black computational thought. If you could define this for us. One of my favorite lines that you have in the conclusion section, and again, it's open access online, so I really encourage you guys to check it out, is that Black computational thought is not simply to say that Black people did some shit with some numbers. And so on one hand, we have Kalundi's point that, you know, African people are like the most measured people on the planet, you know? They love to hold up a ruler to us, to count us, and all of this stuff. And we would like to, we have some counting and accounting that we would like to do from our perspective, both on post-colonial elites and, you know, the ongoingness of colonization. But I think there's also a deeper question here. You know, there's an aspect of, to what degree is the social implications of technology shaped by who holds the power? And to what degree is there something constitutive of computation that in and of itself has some kind of central violence in relationship to land and indigenous people? So I know that that was like a 10-minute speech transposed as a question. But just to recap, if you and Kalundi and Ayantu, if you could expand a little more on Black indigeneity on the continent, what does that mean? What are you responding to? And for Romy, if you could expand a little more on Black computational thought. And you guys can let me know what order you'd prefer to go in.
Is it all right if I begin, Kalundi?
Take us, please.
No.
Okay, so, you know, like Khadijah was saying, I think there's such a, so when I write on Ethiopia, I have always gotten pushback, but it's often from Ethiopian nationalists or people who have some stake, some claim on Ethiopia as an entity. This could be academics, NGO workers, and so on. But I have never gotten almost universal pushback on any topic I write on, as when I frame Oromo people or when I talk about African people as indigenous. There is such a strong reaction against trying to think of Africans within an indigenous lens. And I think that speaks in part to how normalized the state is in Africa, although the state is so young and so foreign to many people. Like, Ethiopia as a state has no meaning to my grandmother, for example. Like, it's not how she thinks about herself, it's not how she thinks about her history, and so on. I also just want to note that the 2007 United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is not perfect, but has been so important to indigenous people in the West. But it has completely, the categories employed here have completely erased even the possibility of Africans being considered indigenous or having like the same struggles as indigenous people elsewhere. While I don't want to dismiss it, I do think that it's an example of the foreclosing of possibilities that Africans are indigenous, that they have issues and concerns that are similar but also unique and different to their own context on the continent. I think probably the most, I'm trying to think of like the most recent and egregious example of anti-indigenousness from, I think it's Mahmoud Mamdani. I feel like if we're gonna talk about African indigeneity, we must discuss Mamdani, who is a social scientist out of Makerere University in Kampala on indigenous land. He's also an academic at Columbia University. So he has both. He's very dominant within the field of African studies, but he also has a global sort of clout from his position at Columbia. He has a book recently came out called Neither Native Nor Settler, an incredibly anti-African book in that it basically dismisses African people existing outside the categories invented by social scientists, outside the categories that the state deploys to understand us and to frame us. And essentially, it's such a, I'm trying to be nice and professional.
Just say it. Just say it.
But I think Mamdani is an important entry point for investigating the why of the lack of, or like the strong aversion to trying to understand Africans outside the categories of the state. So one of Mamdani's central argument is that ethnicity, this term that I hate because of it's not just useless, but it's harmful, that ethnicity was invented by colonialism, but we're supposed to just accept the state created by colonialism somehow. Anyway, more on Mamdani later, because I feel like all three of us have things to say. But I think when I try to think through indigeneity, specifically within the Oromo context, I'm trying to think about of Oromos as autonomous people who have their own knowledge system, and despite being conquered and incorporated into the Ethiopian state, who are not defined entirely by that experience. So, for example, Khadijah mentioned the Oromo artist Hachalu Hundessa, who I feel like is a good example of someone who is existing within the contemporary Ethiopian nation state, but who is deploying categories and ways of thinking and memories that the state either does not recognize, seeks to erase, or completely speaks over. So the kinds of stories and memories Hachalu shares in songs like Malanjira, Do I Even Exist, and his posthumous album titled Mal Lisa, which translates to what is the answer, what is the solution. You know, translations are always off. It's this deeper ontological question of what is to be of us, essentially, at this juncture. And for me, Hachalu is making possible like a different genre of being human. I've been nagging Khadijah because I'm working through the dissertation, and recently Khadijah said to me, well, actually, like, you know, she's a Wintarian a bit, and just got me thinking about this question of a different genre of being human, because I think this is what's really like at stake. It's not about social science, it's not about archival studies specifically, it's about what does indigenous thinking, what genres of being does indigenous thinking make possible at this juncture in this burning world. I think I'll let Kalundi take it from here.
Okay, thank you. I was hoping that Ayantu would do all the money so that I wouldn't have to, but she's avoided that. But let me talk about it in a completely different way. I would like to just say that the question of indigeneity is a problem for European power. It's not a problem for anybody else. All people know who they are. Now, European power has one simple problem, okay? It is trying to do to us what it did first to its own people. The Europeans who live in Europe today are not, I'm just going to use the right word, they are not normal people. Sorry, I can't see anyone in the audience there, but I'm assuming there are a lot of Europeans there. You are not normal people, okay? But it's not your fault. Here's what happened. You are bounded by a way of thinking that begins with the Enlightenment and people like Martin Luther and ends with people like Karl Marx. And you exist within a kind of hermeneutic system that those thinkings created, such that even when you wanted to break away from the conditions that were imposed on you, you simply reinforced the thinking that had created those conditions. The best example is the British province of Lancashire. Lancashire is in the northwest of England. In the 1890s, it controlled 90% of the global trade in processing cotton. Basically, cotton grown anywhere in the world was going to end up in Lancashire and be processed there and re-exported from there. There is a reason why Lancashire has like 5 of the most prominent teams in the English League, because the teams like Bolton, Liverpool, Manchester United, Manchester City, Everton, and I think a couple of others all come from Lancashire. And they do that, in my view, because this was the space of the most massive human displacement and transformation of European people, where their farms and their countrysides and their forests were transformed into spaces for factories and mines. And people were dumped into what they're calling cities. And at one point, England and Ireland had the largest slums in all of Western Europe. And as the British writer E.P. Thompson says, that the process of creating the English working class was one of the most violent processes of all the processes that created the Western European working class. One of the important things of that was to tear people away from their sense of identity and give them new identities. And things like mass sports, especially soccer, which I'd really like to point out, because I was not allowed to say this quite openly as a young man. Soccer, which is a sport that I absolutely detest, and I think actually should be banned. But having said that, the purpose was to give people all these new identities. And that is why people identify with football teams as if they're identifying with their families, and are exploited through this process, through buying all that junk, you know, the uniforms and so on, and spending a lot of money watching them on television. But let me stop ranting about that. All indigenous people think the same way, not because we have talked to each other, but because it is simply the organic way in which human beings began to think before this process, which became a globally dominant process called the Industrial Revolution, and the ideas of the Enlightenment behind it went global and basically began to colonize and massacre people in new ways. Because this new type of thinking has 3 important things. The first one is the way it centralizes the human being in terms of events. I'll give you a very simple example. People keep talking about climate change, and people keep talking about how the world is going to end. I don't think the world is going to end. I think there might be huge catastrophes as a result of the climate emergency that we are facing today, okay? But I think those huge catastrophes are most likely simply going to kill off all or much of humanity and possibly mammalian life. And we might disappear from the planet. But the planet will continue existing. It will continue existing in new forms and new life forms, some of which may not depend on breathing oxygen. But just because our own actions on the planet are going to finish us off, it's not right for us to start saying that the planet is going to end. We are going to end, and which might be a good thing. But you see, indigenous people had been warning you about this for a long time. And the centrality of humans is one of the problems. The separation of the human consciousness from nature's spirit is another very, very big problem. And that was the problem, again, of Enlightenment thinking when you got into the hard materialism of the Feuerbachs and then later on, ultimately, people like Karl Marx, which was a misunderstanding of what the spirit of real socialism would be. And then finally, of course, the demotion of women. from their very, very central place in the organization of life among human beings. Those are the three things that the Enlightenment period brings and that whiteness seeks to impose on the rest of the world. Now, when we talk about indigeneity, we're talking about simply people going back to being normal, okay? And it shouldn't be seen as a mystery. And I think that we need to start, if we go back to the question of data, it is time for us to start measuring white people. I think people in white societies, number one, you wear too many clothes, okay, and that needs to be counted. You change your clothes too often, that also needs to be counted. You change your clothes even in micro seasons. I have a daughter who works in fashion manufacturing, and she told me that the seasons are very many. It's not just the traditional 4. There are micro seasons that the fashion industry has invented within that. Thirdly, you eat too much, okay? You eat far, far too much, and you eat the wrong foods in the wrong seasons. You want to eat food that is created in spring, in winter, and so on, because you think that your money gives you the right to do this. Now, we need to come also into your kitchens and measure what do you eat, when did you eat it, and where did you get it from. The way you come here and do the same things to Africans in order to measure us for hunger and relief things like that, you see, you need to rediscover what being an actual human being is, because the biggest con job that those in power over people in Europe have done is to seduce you into believing that the way you live is better, is the best way human beings have ever lived on the planet. And as a consequence, you have allowed them to rampage and massacre people and create this dangerous climate imbalance in response to that. Now that the planet is fighting back, everybody's in a panic. And the problem with this data rising of us, they've measured our land, they've measured our water bodies and so on, is that there's now a move under the guise of conservation to come and grab land in Africa again. Okay, especially around where we live here, the Great Lakes region, because nearly all the major freshwater bodies in Africa are either found within Uganda or within 1,000 kilometers of Uganda. And under the guise of conservation and talking about urbanization and mechanizing agriculture, there's a whole move to forcibly move people and seduce people out of the countryside and turn these places into massive agro-mechanic farms.
Kalundi dropping knowledge, and then it's like connection breaking.
As well as fenced off. Europe cannot feed itself anymore. Themselves anymore. Can you give us aid? Instead, they want to come and grab land again. Monopolies involved in this are there in Germany. You see, and these are some of the studies we are trying to do, I say, to build our own digital capacity, to be like the vet I talked about, and to collect information in a way that we think is useful to our people. Because most of our anthropologists and social scientists and so on, of which Professor Mamdani is a prime example, if you agree to be a native informer and come and measure Africans on behalf of Europeans, you will get all the grants and scholarships and fellowships, which I call slave ships, that you want, okay? If you are measuring from the opposite point of view, you will then always constantly be told that your proposals are not good enough and that your language is faulty and your conceptual design needs to be looked at again, and you'll constantly be disturbed. So what we decided to do, not that we were ever very tied to that, was to simply start building our own capacity to measure our emphasize. It means looking at European people and teaching them how to change the way they understand their place on the planet, not just European people. And in other words, indigenous values are not historical or quaint or museum. They are values for the future. That is the primary definition, I think, of indigeneity. I think I should stop there for now, but those are some of the points I wanted to make. Thank you.
We turn to you for a talking point. You dropped a dissertation, so thank you so much for that. Just one side note that I wanted to make, and then I want to allow Romy to respond to the question, is that Ayantu was talking about the kind of pushback that we encounter when we're making a case about the Oromos and the Horn of Africa, right? And some of it is people who directly have a stake in maintaining the status quo and benefit from the production, the ongoing production of the Ethiopian state. The other aspect is, one, with the left, right, to the degree that is willing to acknowledge that the state, might be a problem, is really just U.S. imperialism and maybe sometimes some kind of broadly Western intervention, as if this is a unidirectional phenomenon going onto a blank slate. And, it's very common if you bring up any kind of domestic issues with the state in not just the African continent, but more globally or in the global south, that you are called a PSYOP or a CIA agent, because our number one focus must be the imperial core, which is the US, the UK, maybe, and the western half of the EU. And that's all that you are ever to speak of. And so I think that is a major aspect. And I think the other thing that I just wanted to say is, Romy had mentioned, drawing on Black studies. And, what I get from Black study in particular is thinking through the ongoingness of slavery. This also tends to be the ongoingness of the transatlantic slave trade and how it manifested in the US in particular. And this is an understanding that's so nuanced and sophisticated, but often ends at the border. And so, you think about for Black people in the United States, we're only like 3 generations after the abolition of slavery in the US. In the Ethiopian context, slavery wasn't even legally abolished until 1942. And so how does that shift our understanding? How do we think about it? It's not a question of Black on Black crime, but you have this northern Abyssinian colonization internally to the US, right? I mean, internally to Ethiopia, I apologize. And, what I wanted to say, and what the comment on Mamdani is that, the U.S. does intervene, but it aligns with certain post-colonial elites' interests, who then champion it and then who define what is normal. And so there are certain descendants of monarchs and of settler colonial kingdoms for whom Western colonization was an interruption. And now with what independence means for them is a certain ceding control from the West to allow them to maintain these viciously oppressive states and to restore their hegemony in antagonism to Black indigenous people. So when we're thinking about anti-colonialism, we have to realize that there are, Pan-Africans that are narrated as anti-colonial who, like Nkrumah, banned any dissemination of indigenous flags within Ghana, because it's a restoration of the original kingdom and a restoration of also centralization of the states. And so, it was a reason why Nkrumah had this idea of a central federal state for the African continent. And lastly, Africa is just an invention. I mean, I know that we talk about colloquially, the Africans, but there's no equivalent. We don't think about a North American type of personality or a universal North American claim. There's no universal African claim to make. Why are we defining the needs, the desires, and the evidence of a people based on, just the entire landmass? It's incoherent. With that, I do just want to underline that it's 2:04, so it's wild, but we got 11 minutes left. And so I do want to cede the floor to Romy.
Great, I'll try and sum up this very large and unwieldy concept in a short amount of time. Your question was about defining Black computational thought, yeah. So this comes from a piece that I recently published called Voluptuous Disintegration, A Future History of Black Computational Thought. It's in Digital Humanities Quarterly, and it's open access. And that will do everything that I can't do right now in this short amount of time, but I'd like to try and address it through something that both Kalundi said and Ayantu said, thinking about different genres of the human, as well as this idea of what is normal, and the departure from indigenous ways of knowledge as being non-normative or as being othered or alighted or erased through conquest. And the genres of the human comes from Sylvia Wynter's work, and one of her kind of core tenets is that science is beholden to its cosmogony. It's beholden to the stories that we tell about it. And so even though the Enlightenment tries to break this kind of critical distance between what we consider to be empiricism versus like maybe Judeo-Christian like moral order, there's a falseness to it, that there's still this like replication and reproduction of certain stories about the divine that are kind of reestablished through scientific discourse. And so in order to understand science or empiricism, you have to always contextualize it within the stories that are told about it, therefore genre. So it also separates this idea of universalism as kind of a view from nowhere, that it just emerged, and rather it's situated in particular narratives that come from particular places at particular times. So when we're talking about the Enlightenment, empiricism, measurement, calculation, we're very much talking about continental Europe around the 17th and 18th century, really. And these are ideas that then inform how we later come to think about things like computation. So a lot of this for me is situated in Denise Fidetta da Silva's work in her text Toward a Global Idea of Race, which does a really incredible genealogy of what she calls modern representation, primarily history and science, and contextualizing it in very particular thinkers around the struggle of interiority and exteriority. That when we're starting to think about scientific discourse and how ocularly centric it is in terms of proving things, it needs to look out at the world, discern differences, and then treat those formal differences as somehow indicative of an internal lack, or what she calls affectability. That interiority is like René Descartes and is Immanuel Kant. It's the separate cognition that is like purely rational, that is not being acted upon by external sources, but is able to look out at the world, see things as being insurmountably different, and that forces are acting on those things because they don't have agency or will. Those things meaning people from other places, those things meaning like nature itself, and that then allows it to be measured in order to be extracted from, and not to give it any kind of rights or liberties, freedoms, agency, autonomy, nothing. So when we're thinking about computation, this is a lot of the history that it comes from. There's a text called The Cultural Logic of Computation by David Columbia, who makes some really interesting connections between this kind of high rationality, interiority, to the ways that cognition and computation are kind of equated in the late 1950s, early 1960s, kind of built upon some of Noam Chomsky's ideas about linguistics, that language is something that's not socially acquired, but there's an internal mechanism, an interior cognition, a kind of radical machine in his terms, that is responsible for understanding the syntax of language, that language is a very syntactical thing, not a socially produced thing. And so researchers thinking about artificial intelligence at the time and how you would measure intelligence or cognition within computational terms turn to language and turn to this heavy emphasis on syntax. And David Columbia kind of coins this as computationalism, as the idea that if cognition is inherently a kind of computational process, a kind of cold, high rationality, then by extension, all thought or all phenomena can be understood on computational terms, which is, again, this kind of very clear separation between interiority and exteriority that only privileges the internal cognition as something that has autonomy or agency, and nothing else does. And so when we're thinking about these kind of legacies of computation now, this is kind of what's consistently upheld in the kind of worldview of people that run tech industry or worldview within computational science. So again, these are the narratives that go alongside computer science and opens up then other narratives or other genres for how we might try to practice computation without kind of returning to the well of that history to then resurrect or, ameliorate its own violences, because that doesn't quite make sense to me. So as I'm trying to work through what Black computational thought might mean, it's one, trying to very acutely situate what has become universalized as computation, as computer science, as universalism, as empiricism, and then to understand that knowledge production happens outside of that bubble, and that it happens through various practices. So when I gave an introduction to some of my work, I talked about the freedom quilts, I talked about the Negro Motorist Green Book. For me, these are more crucial examples to think about what computation might mean. That's not computationalism. That's not about understanding formal characteristics of difference as being entirely separable and therefore not having any ethical commitment to them, what we call objectivity, but instead that there are practices in which the information and knowledge production is in relation to the people that are doing it and in the place that they are doing it. So the quilting bees, for example, with the freedom quilts, is a very contextual source for how people are sharing and making agreements about trust about where the information comes from, how it's codified, and then kind of how it's decentralized out back into the world, which is very different than thinking about a server farm, for example. So it makes more explicit these actions of interpretation, kind of situated knowledge, and more importantly, like the agreements and relationships that we have to knowledge and information production.
Thank you. So one really good piece of information is that my ADHD dyslexic situation, we still have another 19 more minutes. 19. And so I wanna ask another question to you, Romy, and then we'll go back around to you, Ayantu, and Kalundi. And so, Romy, could you say a little bit more about this relationship between a regime evaluation and computation? And how are they antagonistic to the notion of self-determination that you outline in the piece?
Yeah, so regime is an interesting word. Like, just kind of implies by force to an extent, right? And Kalundi has kind of emphasized like that African people are overly measured in all of these ways. And there's a necessity for a kind of analytics or measurement in order to create these very discernible categories that are fixed, right? And then to ascribe differential valuation to them. So this is what is normal and made transparent, kind of embodied through like white cis male European abilities and standards as the universal for what the human is, and then everything else by contrast is inherently different and then devalued. So this regime evaluation is always requires some kind of analytic metric, and then it upholds a moral discourse upon which people are then differentially measured. And so computation is kind of can be an exacerbation of that, right? It's kind of like amplified, or there's a higher frequency, or maybe like if we're talking about the case of machine learning or algorithmic processing, we don't even know at what point the decision is made, right? But the kind of standards and normative constructions of what would be like an input overly determines the decision making for things within computation and then create exacerbated results, right? And so in the piece that I wrote, I'm trying to understand self-determination outside of that fixedness, outside of just the metrics of difference and measurement. And in order to do that, I'm like very heavily trying to source material from a Black trans theorist named Marquise Bey, who's thinking about self-determination as not an individual project, but one that's always in relation. And he kind of is trying to open up the vulnerability that happens when we come together to kind of pull things apart or make them undone. And in this case, they're referring to fixed identity. And so self-determinism in this context is really the ability to not have a fixed sense of self, but to kind of redefine in concert with other people and to negotiate the kind of vulnerability or risk that happens when doing so, and to be capacious for those things to be in flux, essentially.
Thank you very much for that. And on that note, I have basically a very similar question for each of you. And so, Ayantu, how are you thinking about indigenous self-determination in relationship to producing records, oral history, and data? How does indigenous memory making compare and contrast to dominant tech infrastructures based on your observation? And to get kind of meta about the conference, so we do the budget cuts instead of having and also like scarcity of available interpreters. We don't have like a human Oromo and Uganda translation, but we have Google auto translates. And so Kalundi, what do you have to say about Black indigenous self-determination in relationship to this specific kind of technology of using, for example, Google Translate right now into Luganda and Oromo? What are your thoughts on that? And you guys can, maybe Ayantu and then Kalundi. Does it work?
All right. I'm glad we have a little bit more time. I definitely resonate with what you're saying, Romy, via Marquise Bey about self-determination. Sorry, I hate mics, but I know like for accessibility purposes, we need them. I think for me, like self-determination, specifically indigenous self-determination in relation to producing records is very much about beginning with African people as already knowing, as already having sources of knowledge, as already having, I use archives and records for lack of a better word. But part of my dissertation work is also what are the languages that are more precise and that are more contextually relevant to how Oromo people think about such things. Because I take for granted that all people, not states, all people are producers. In order to exist, you need to produce knowledge. You need to make use of that knowledge. You need to transmit that knowledge in various ways. For me, you know, because in archival studies, we begin, there's a tendency, not me specifically, but there's a tendency to begin from X group is marginalized. There's a gap in the archives. They're not in the archives or they're misrepresented in the archives. So then what's the solution? Let us either provide more, you know, find more records in the archives. Let's put them in the archives is kind of the solution. Or the other solution might be, let's create a community archive. And I think both approaches leave intact the hegemony of Western archival thinking, around, and especially thinking around like what knowledges archives make possible and impossible, what knowledges they help devalue. And I think for me, self-determination is beginning as if Oromos are the center, and as if already, and not as if, there is, like what are those traditions and ways of thinking about time, because to think about archives is to think about time, which thankfully is something that's being taken up in archival studies, especially over the last decade, by people like Kimberly Anderson and others. Yeah, I think let me pause there, because if there's time, then I could elaborate.
Am I supposed to speak now? Yeah, sorry if you see me waving about. I normally don't get flies in this room, but there's one that's come and is flying around. I think it's trying to make us feel comfortable by turning this into one of those famine aid videos, because there's always, you know, Africans with flies in the picture. But if I move my hand suddenly, don't worry about it. I think Ayantu touched on the matter when she explains how even in academic circles, the mere raising of the question of indigeneity becomes a live wire. It makes everybody uncomfortable. In relation to the question that is being raised, you then take it to what Romy has said on the question of the computations of history, the history of computation. This measurement has always been going on. What data and digital technology in the hands of corporations has done is to, as Carl Sagan said in a 1995 essay, is to progressively monopolize the process and outpace us, you know, decade by decade until they are very, very, very far ahead of everybody else. But we have always been computing and measuring. The question is now who owns the process. And I think part of the problem was when the whole idea of especially digital computation migrated from academia, which is largely where it lived for a long time in the West, and became a corporate activity. I think there's an interesting book about a man called Richard Stallman that talks about that process. I think the book is called Free as in Freedom. And that gave rise to what eventually became the attempts of the open society movement. Because to answer your question, therefore, directly, what we need is to rebuild that autonomy, even at the level of digital computation, the way we are struggling to build it in terms of simply holding on to our knowledges and our knowledge systems and systematizing them. Because the one thing and the gap that I'm seeing in what Romy is talking about, if I could reference another book that really illustrates this problem of the collision between what Ayantu is talking about and what is happening. I forget the author's name, and I can't tamper with the internet setup here because it's very jumpy. There's a book called The Global Interior. I don't know if anyone has heard of this book, which talks about how the American Department of the Interior ironically becomes a globally interested institution, and how this begins with the East Coast elites of America. The East Coast elites of America constantly even measuring the further western parts of the United States continent in terms of looking for minerals and other things, and this becomes a global enterprise. And she talks about how basically this measurement takes place. So when you talk about what, say, Google and whoever bring to the table with their interpretation, it reminds me of a saying I once heard that I understand comes from the African-American community, which incidentally I'd like to point out is an indigenous community, not indigenous to America, but what I mean is that their experience of the last 400 years of the United States in whatever form is actually part of the African experience. And this is an artificial boundary that has been created between them. This is what happens if you take African people and put them there under those circumstances. That is the reaction and the result. It's part of the African experience, and it is indigenous to the African people, in my view. The weakness we have had here on the African continent is to fail to understand this, unless we can take advantage of it in there, and only talking about
Kalundi,
racism.
could you just repeat your
instead
last
of understanding the African. The proverb is that a dog that brings a bone is going to take some. That's what African Americans say. A dog that brings a bone is going to take some, okay? Google has brought this translation. What is it going to take as a result, okay? Will we not reach a day when some executive and technical person from Google can legitimately argue that they speak and understand the language and the meaning of the language better than some farmer or market person in Uganda, because they have it digitized and their machines are telling them the right thing to do? And what will that do for the spiritual meanings embedded within the language? So I think this idea of having private corporations being able to monopolize the translation of especially native languages is extremely dangerous. But the solution is for us to catch up in that thing as well. Because there's something we haven't talked about at all, which is what I call social architecture. We have survived up to now because we have social architecture. There's a reason up until President Museveni here militarized the police force, that in a country of then 30 million people, we literally had a police force of less than 12,000 police officers, okay? Whereas in the United Kingdom, and actually by global standards, there's a ratio that they believe should be the number of police officers per citizen. And when you look at the ratio, it is much, much, much higher than that. And this is a ratio defined by white societies. Okay, because the reason why white societies function the way they do is that they have to be heavily surveilled and policed. Okay, that is why the tendency is that the smallest problem you have with another human being in a European society is to ask the state to come and intervene. Okay, or a corporation backed by the state, because you cannot trust yourselves to handle a dispute between each other in a civilized manner. Okay, because as I told you, as Europeans, you're no longer normal. Okay? So the point is that a lot of social problems and other types of problems are handled through social architecture here. And language is one of the tools of social architecture in managing and mediating and solving problems. Regulation of the state, but would be resolved properly. Now, if we continue like this, you're going to find that data and computation migrates even into the question of managing questions of social architecture. Okay, I can imagine an algorithm that can produce a verdict and a sentence for certain types of cases, depending on what data has been put in. So you don't even need a judge. You need a machine that functions as a judge and measures what the problem has been as entered in and offers a certain number of solutions as remedies. Now, when you have a nexus of the state and the corporations controlling, as Romy has said, what happens with AI and what happens with the way in which things are interpreted and input, you're then asking for danger. So unless we begin a process of either taking control of this kind of digitization process or building alternatives to it, we are exposing ourselves to certain types of dangers. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Look, here's a technical problem. We got like 4 minutes left. I feel like if I ask a question, in fairness, I don't know if you guys can answer this in the last 4 minutes. Do you each want to share a last thought? Or would somebody from the audience like to share a last comment? Yeah, maybe would anybody in the audience like to ask a question or share a comment? I can also, if you want to like say it, I can be your ventriloquist thing. No? Oh. Oh, over here?
Thank you. Thank you. I hope I can get to be coherent. Thank you so much for this. I like the words to say how illuminating and inspiring this has been. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the ways that we maybe are forced to negotiate languages, platforms, spaces that we don't necessarily like because of their colonial backgrounds, and also their oppressive characteristics, but that we are somehow forced to use in order to communicate with each other. As an example, myself as a Venezuelan, as a Latin American, wouldn't be able to listen to all of this if I didn't speak English. So I am very interested in the ways that we can and should appropriate these languages and these spaces. And, especially brushing off these ideas of, yes, you think about all of this, but here you are in Europe speaking English about this. So I would really like to hear you a little bit, your thoughts about the ways that we can and should appropriate these spaces because they already kind of belong to us, and what are the ways that you feel should be the most fair, ethical, and productive for the bridges to continue to build. Thank you.
Thank you for that incredible question. I know, we operate typically on CP time, colored people time, and we would be running over. However, this is Germany. We're very efficient here, and it is 2:29. I will just take in charge. And so I'm gonna make one really quick comment about this, is that it's very common that people cite this Audre Lorde quotes, you cannot dismantle the master's house with the master's tools. And there's one register of that saying that means like literally, like you can't use capitalism to end capitalism, okay, sure. The other aspect is that the master has nothing without us. The master does not have true domination. Even this is not the King's English. We took this shit over. We creolized it. We made it our own. Even our own language and our own knowledge systems sometimes are even partially erased, but we forced them through into this freaking language that we have to use in order to be deemed even worthy of surviving, right? And so we take this shit over. And so there is forcible conscription into these settler, colonial, cryptocurrency, libertarian, white tech bro projects, right? But we can also rob them. We can also like take their shit, make it ours, like disseminate it to our people and do what we have to do. Like, for me in tech, you know, this is a very unusual conversation, and I'm really like grateful for y'all being in the audience on like a Saturday afternoon, for each of you making the time. And again, it's really unique because most of the critical technology conversations you're gonna hear are not just as, not only not as capacious as this, but also is more typical for people to be merchants of doom and tell you that the sky is falling. And we do have agency. And so, you know, there's a theory, social death, that like slavery, transatlantic slavery made a complete and utter break between African-American people and their indigenous knowledge systems. It's not just that people who are captured into chattel slavery are from Africa, but they were overwhelmingly from indigenous nations within the African continent. And we see that in the syntax, right? No school, no resources allocated to any kind of state program, but people transmitted that knowledge. You know, people were getting captured at like 12, 13, having kids without their elders, like en route, passing down those knowledge systems. So I do think that we have agency. And I'm sorry to take that over, but it's already 2:31. And so thank you so much. Thank you, Kamnago.